Welcome back, everybody. This is the sixth in a series of tips from in the field section of my new book, The AMC Guide to Outdoor Digital Photography. And today we're going to talk about depth of field. And depth of field is basically how much of your image seems to be sharp from front to back. You can have a very wide depth of field where your foreground is sharp and your distant horizon is sharp, or a very narrow depth of field where just that one thing you focus on is sharp and everything else goes nice and soft. Now, depth of field is determined by a variety of things. The wider your focal length, the wide angle lenses have a greater depth of field in general than a telephoto lens. And also how close you are to your subject determines depth of field. As you get closer to things, if you're really close, it's really hard to get a lot of depth of field. So you have a much narrower depth of field as you're closer to your main subject, and you have a greater depth of field if your main subject is farther away. Then there's your aperture or f-stop. This has a huge influence on depth of field. Now those smaller apertures, the big f numbers like f16, f22, they give you a lot of depth of field. Whereas the large apertures, the small f numbers like f4, f2.8 give you a very narrow depth of field. And I talked about in last week's tip how by using a wide angle lens and stretching out the scene from front to back and getting a large depth of field, you can create some real visual depth. And you do that by using like f16, f22. But you can also create some visual depth by shooting at a narrow f-stop like f4, f2.8 with a longer lens and just having your main subject in focus and letting your background go a little soft. And there's some implied visual depth there because the viewer understands that the thing that's in focus must be closer to the camera than the distant background. So depth of field is really one of those really important creative decisions you need to make. Don't let your camera make it by shooting in program mode. Shoot in aperture priority mode or manual mode so that you are choosing your depth of field, not your camera. Now, when you're trying to maximize depth of field, you need to understand a concept called hyperfocal distance. And basically for every focal length and each f-stop for that focal length, there's a different hyperfocal distance that you focus on to maximize depth of field. So for example, with a 24mm lens at f16, if you focus at 4 feet away from the camera, you'll be able to get from 2 feet to infinity in focus in your final image. That 4 feet is your hyperfocal distance. Now, how do you know what that hyperfocal distance is? Well, you need some sort of way to calculate that. And if you go online, you can Google depth of field calculator and you'll find a bunch out there where you can plug in this information. I like to use an app called PhotoCalc on my iPhone. I believe there's an Android version where you plug in that information and you can determine your hyperfocal distance while you're out there shooting. This is really important if you want to maximize that depth of field for those big landscapes and create that visual depth that you're always looking for. Okay, so that's this week's tip. I want you to get out there and practice using depth of field as a creative tool. Take a bunch of photos of the same subject at different f-stops so you can see the different depths of field at those f-stops. And also practice calculating that hyperfocal distance so you can maximize your depth of field for your big landscape photos. Now, for more photo tips and to learn about my book, The AMC Guide to Outdoor Digital Photography, visit monkmanphoto.com.